talk to you about getting registered. So I'm really pleased today to introduce Jen Vanek, who is one of our 3 CARLA fellows this semester. And she is a doctoral candidate in second language education. And her dissertation focuses on strategies for preparing migrant adult learners for the digital world by building digital literacy skills that help them maintain home language proficiency, support their English language learning, and open paths needed to support migration and settlement. And today she's going to be presenting one aspect of that research, one set of data that she's revealing publicly for the first time today. And the title of her talk is Adult English Language Learners, Untrained Teachers, and the Language of Digital Literacy, Early Findings from a DBR Study. So please welcome Jen Vanek.
Thank you guys so much for being here. This is the perfect friendly audience to introduce these data to the world. And before I get started, I just want to explain DBR means design-based research. It's a participatory methodology that has 2 goals. One is to work with local stakeholders to create a solution to a very real problem. And then through that process, the second goal is accomplished where you can theorize about what you know about learning and teaching by the creation of that tool. So DBR is very often longitudinal and also lends itself to an alternative format for a dissertation study. Because you're approaching a design problem from different directions, each of those directions can turn into a nice manuscript. So this is one potential future manuscript and just one lens that I'm using in preparation of the resource that you'll get a glimpse of too. So I'm only talking about one aspect of the data today. That's the important thing. So I want to set the stage for you first. This is not news to you. We live in a technologically rich society, and when newcomers arrive, they either gain the skills to embrace this digital world, or they don't have agency to support them in their resettlement and in supporting their families. So a lot of this work of digital literacy and English language learning in the US happens in adult basic education programs, which in the state of Minnesota are part of the K-12 system, part of the Department of Education, sort of separate and apart, but under that umbrella. But the state of Minnesota, like most of the country, only can satisfy about 10% of the need available. Okay, or the need that's there. So a lot of the work happens in community-based organizations, in technology community labs, where English language learners or whoever comes into the lab will be supported by a volunteer or perhaps an AmeriCorps member. So in the ABE programs, there are licensed teachers with ongoing PD. In the community-based organizations, that's less likely to happen. So my study is in response to this reality, and it actually begins several years ago with a pilot study that I conducted in Martha's SLE seminar class. The pilot was a case study at one of these community technology labs, and it was very learner-focused. My lens was Bonnie Norton's alternative SLA theories from a post-structural view, where I was really trying to understand learner experience. And then that informed my current dissertation study, which you can see are essentially three studies, where I'm looking at this from a teacher lens, understanding teacher needs, and we're working on designing a resource, and then the third is the language aspect, and that's what you're going to hear about today. So first, a few observations about the pilot study. This was in a lab that, although located very close to a neighborhood in the metro area that supports a lot of Horn of Africa migrants, draws people from all over the area just south of downtown. So in the lab, you might have a dislocated worker who's coming in to learn how to beef up their resume, or you might have a Somali grandma who, when you say the letter G, pushes J on the keyboard. So, and not only that, nobody would always come the same time at the same time. They wouldn't come the same days, and it was just this complete flux and chaos. So. But despite that, I managed to interview several learners and observe them in their work. And what I learned from the pilot, this is just the pilot, we're not going to get into it much more deeply than this. Oh, these are arrows going across the screen, which apparently don't show up too well here. But the learners were prioritizing digital literacy over English language learning that was being offered at an adult basic ed program literally around the corner. okay? They didn't want to sign up for formal language classes, but they wanted to gain digital literacy skills that they would then use themselves to look for work and to study on their own. And they saw this as the most expeditious means by which to reach their future imagined communities, which, if you're reading Norton, is this community to which you hope to belong, your current actions hope to, supported by your current investments, will get you to. So that's the finding, the big finding from the pilot study. So while I was there noticing all of this, I was also noticing some very characteristic problematic instructional practices. First, there was always a teacher at the beginning, at the front of the room, with a PowerPoint and slides, and learners expected to click along with a very long handout, okay? Very little differentiated instruction, very little one-on-one support, making it, and remember the description of the learning community, right? So very challenging situation. Second, the resources that the learners were expected to click to when they had to were often on very confusing web interfaces. This is actually an example of one of them. Materials bound to cultural knowledge and high literacy, print literacy skills. So there were just a lot of things going on that were getting in the way of this investment that these learners felt they were making. So although it was a privileged investment, the programs weren't doing much to support that investment. And my conclusion from this study is that in order to help learners develop the digital literacy skills that they need to reach their goals, the programs have to mitigate some of these challenges. And hence then the dissertation study. The dissertation study is guided by the work of Heidi Silver-Pakia and Steve Reeder, who did a study on the threshold of skill, language proficiency and computer skill required for online learning. And they found that it's entirely variable depending upon an equitable balance amongst these three things: learner skills, the support available, and the technology demands. So I noticed in my pilot that the technology demands were very high, the support was very low, and so the only learners that could be reached were those that were like right in the sweet spot. What I'm trying to prove or show with my dissertation is that if we lower the technology demands and increase the instructional support, then the instruction that's available in these labs will be accessible to a broader audience of learners. So that's the stage set. Okay, so the dissertation is, in a sense, to confirm some of the observations about instruction that I saw in the pilot, and to build an instructional resource to make it easier for these AmeriCorps members to provide the instruction. So I had AmeriCorps members at 4 different sites. They were all part of the same umbrella program. And each of them was representative of the context that are of the CBOs that participate. There are like 35 CBOs that generally participate in this AmeriCorps program, and I tried to hit one from all the different types. I used classroom observation, I examined materials, and we did like 10 focus groups over the course of like 7 months. So we were talking a lot. My goal was to create a resource to provide structure so that it'd be easier for them to provide instruction to their students. So this fits into educational research design. This is another way of looking at DBR, as written about by McKinney and Reeves, who think about understanding, building knowledge about teaching and learning as a series of studies that might happen within a whole macro study. So you've got the macro, and then you've got these mesocycles where anything that you learn within these micro phases informs the meso, and anything you learn in the meso informs the next meso. My study is right here. My study, all 3 studies basically complete the first mesocycle of this much longer work. So phase 1, the exploratory phase, is both the, you see analysis and exploration, that's both the pilot study and my first study, which is talking to AmeriCorps members and finding out what the challenges were. The second one is actually building the resource. And then the third one is an analysis on how this whole thing went. So with the goal of working toward this. This is where we are right now. This is the instructional resource that we have built and is being used right now by the participating Corps members. So during this build then, we learned a lot about language and vocabulary, and that's what we're going to hear about now. So, study 3 was informed by all 4 sites, but I'm going to show you data from one because there's characteristic data in here that represent a finding that stretches across all the sites, but it was most salient in this particular setting. I'm calling the site Ascend. Ascend serves a mixed population of mostly Horn of Africa language speakers. This is not the same site as the pilot site, just to be clear. And it's all adult learners. Most of them are very low English literacy and Somali literacy, actually. And only a few of them were to the point where they were working toward their GED. So, you know, the problem motivating the study is what we saw in the pilot, where the language of instruction was not accessible to most of the students in the lab. And the primary phase of this phase of exploration is to come to an understanding of the key features of academic language for digital literacy. So what is the actual language that the instructors need to use in order to make their skill instruction accessible to their learners, and by what instructional strategies is that best accomplished? So essentially, I'm doing a functional analysis on the language of digital literacy. The work is I guess motivated by first Halliday's work in the construction of what he termed a mathematical register, where he came up with a corpus of language and explanation of the language required for teaching mathematics. And I followed the functional approach to Halliday that was written about by Schleppergrill, where she suggests that a functional approach identifies the configuration of grammatical structures typical of or expected in different kinds of socially relevant contexts. And that by exposing these, we can define the register, okay? The configuration of lexical and grammatical resources which realize a particular meaning within that particular context. So this chart is actually from Schleppergrill's textbook on the issue, where she draws on Halliday. Schleppergrill presents this structure for organizing elements of a particular register. So, and she talks about 3 particular variables: field, text, and mode. For this work, I'm only focusing on field. Okay, that was the first big choice. Field describes how you present ideas, and they're your ideational choices. And in this particular study, these are the nouns or the vocabulary words or the verbs, the instructions that are required to get learners to accomplish the skills. And again, here are the questions. So what are the linguistic structures evident in the classroom discourse on digital literacy in these contexts, I should qualify? And then what strategies do these Corps members suggest have been useful for promoting proficiency? And I should actually say what they demonstrate, because this is more than just them talking. This is me watching them, and they're looking at their data too. So to account for the lexical instructional items and their associated meanings, I analyzed recordings of classroom observation, I analyzed instructional materials, and focus group data. And the focus group data included participants describing their beliefs about the role of language instruction within the skill development. I did this in order to find a relationship between English language proficiency and skill development within these contexts. And these data combined with several samples taken from the observational data and field notes results in a better understanding of the language of digital literacy evident in the classrooms that then is part of the final resource that gets shared with the broader community. What we're looking at is just an example of the one of the classroom observation exchanges, and just gives you an idea of the coding process I used. I used MaxQDA for this work, where I went in and I first did structural coding to sort the data into the 3 different studies, and then did second round descriptive coding to help identify salient themes that the data presented. So, finding 1, the first question, remember what are the particular structures, linguistic structures. So, my original intent had been to document the language of digital literacy instruction as some sort of unitary academic language. Wow, that's really was not possible, given the chaos in the labs and the fluid nature of the people coming and going, and the different literacy levels and language skills of people there. It just wasn't going to happen. But I did find some unifying factors. Essentially, the field, as Slepigal might say, was constituted by key vocabulary used in the North Star Digital Literacy Assessment. Each of the participating community-based organizations has to give this assessment to their learners. It's their outcomes measure, their key outcome measure. So the core members teaching in these sites were encouraged to teach to the test, basically. So a lot of the key vocabulary comes from that. So to give you an example, this is a list of standards on which the computer basics assessment is based, and a lot of the words that you see here actually appear in the transcripts too. So I don't actually think that that's problematic, because there are so many learners coming and going. These core members, who, remember, are not trained teachers, need a place to start, and I think that why not? This is as good a place as any. Okay, so finding the first finding, or the second finding with respect to the first question is that although there wasn't a lot of variation in the core vocabulary, there was variation in the explanatory language used in introducing these skills. Each core member and the volunteers in the labs tailored their explanations to meet their community of learners, which I think is really promising. Because the learners varied, so too the explanations needed to vary. Additionally, these sites had volunteers coming and going, and so there would be times where I'd be in the corner and I would be listening to the teacher explain something, and then the volunteers would circulate, and then they would use totally different language explaining the same thing, which can be sort of challenging, I think, for the learners. This is an example. This is one example of many. The E is Eric, the pseudonym for the teacher. Highlight, click and drag, and then click B, and then we have the volunteer following up with something that's actually more complicated, I think. So now you have to swipe it. So he's introducing all of this new language that is equally abstract and inaccessible in support of highlight, click and drag. And I'm suggesting with a little consistency this might be a problem mitigated easily. So again, another learning that goes into the resource at the end for dissemination. Also interesting to know is that the explanations of the skills always seem to start with a group presentation going down a list of vocabulary with some support by showing slides like this, sort of decontextualized representations of the skill, and then one-on-one work, going out and practicing and making sure people understood what was going on. So it was never just one verbal explanation. So I think that's important to just keep in mind. Oh, here we have. Okay. All right. So I actually think the findings to question 2 are much more interesting. I think question 1 just sort of sets up question 2. And the most interesting thing here is that because I was working with these Corps members for such a long time, I was actually able to see growth in their instructional strategies, which is heartening because it's really, there are so many learners that depend on their instruction in order to meet their goals. So it was very heartening. So at the beginning of the project, vocabulary instruction was clearly secondary to instruction of skills, okay? It was either provided by just embedded questions or embedded into descriptions of skills, or maybe by a couple display questions. There were a few intentional definitions provided and sometimes a comprehension check, but it was always done in a large cohort, always starting with a large group of people. So really nobody had any idea if somebody in the back understood or not. So much like the pilot study, actually. But what I saw along the way as the project progressed and the Corps, and interestingly, this is something that gets theorized for the bigger paper, as the Corps members became more vested in the development of the instructional resource, they started watching their learners more closely. And they started to understand what engagement, and this is another part of the paper, is defining engagement, and they're describing what they think engagement means and what it looks like in the classroom. And they started to pay attention to how their treatment of language impacted their learners. And so they began to integrate a wider variety of intentional vocabulary instruction into their skill instruction. So at the beginning of the process, where they might have just done embedded descriptions, presenting large chunks of vocab at one time, supported by maybe a vocabulary worksheet, and then go practice. You can see what was added, demonstration, and then lots of vocabulary review and activities were added. And this is, actually I should have mentioned, this is an observation of the exact same lesson 3 months apart by the same teacher in the same lab. So it's a nice explanation of, or a demonstration of the difference in growth. So I can show you a little bit more data here. So here's an example showing a chunk of vocabulary and skills from this earlier observation. And we're talking about the ribbon, okay? He's trying to teach people how to bold, italicize, and underline format font by showing this PowerPoint slide and giving them this worksheet. Okay, so that what he did, and you'll see in the data, in the transcript, is to just basically he mentions that they're there and he points to them on the slide, and that's the only instruction the learners get. So, you know, and they're all given at once. So there's a B and an I and a U. Who can tell me what B is? Nobody responds. It's bold. So that makes it thicker and darker. Next one, I. You know, there's like nothing. It's just on to the next. And he does this over and over again with all three of these. And then he's not even clear about what's going on. The volunteer says, do you actually want them to type the word? They don't even have Word open yet. And Eric says, well, I was going to have them do this, you know, this activity first and then type it. So he has an instructional sequence, okay, but it's really hard for the learners and for the volunteers there to even know what's going on. In the background, I want you to imagine a busy lab environment, okay, with a security buzzer that's constantly going off, cell phones going off, people coming and going, people talking. So this, in the context of an extremely chaotic environment, made it really challenging for anybody to get anything from it. So a few changes later. So you'll notice he's dropped ribbon entirely. He's not even bothering with ribbon, because who says ribbon when they're going to use nobody? It's like he figured it out. Okay, we don't have to teach this word. And then you'll notice he, instead of doing it all at once, he'll introduce one word, and then he'll have students either look on their worksheet. He's still using the worksheet, but then he's having them, word is open, and he's having them actually practice each time. So he's trying to integrate the skill and the vocabulary together in a way that's more meaningful. It makes more sense. It's still decontextualized because they're writing bold and then bolding it, but it's something. It's something. The other thing that he did, the big thing about this stance, though, about this shift, is that because he's taking a break and learners are able, after each one, there are 3 times the opportunities for differentiated support and instruction. And that's the big difference here. So every break, volunteers are going around the room working with learners and talking to learners. And that's actually where the instruction, I think, is happening. But there are more opportunities for it because there's space created to make it happen. The other thing that's happening now are more resources for practice. So in those exchanges and those opportunities for differentiated instruction, a skill will there's time to react and to assign more activities. And there are a number of these activities online which have been drawn into the resource. So this one is like, there are 3 different ways that you can get a learner to get to these same icons, to understanding these same icons. And then after this, then he's applying them in actual writing exercises. Another thing that's happened is that because of this, the core members decided to include a glossary in our primary resource, so the learners can go back anytime they want to. So the growth, I think, is the most interesting aspect of this. And so what accounts for the shift? Why is the shift happening? I think that the core members were able to arrive at a more sophisticated sense of the role of language in instruction and in skill development. And this is an interesting excerpt from a focus group that happened at the end of June. So we built basically starting in May and built through the summer. And this, I'll just give you a second to read this because I think it's fascinating. So I had a question in my focus group discussion. How do you know when to back off? How do you know when they need more support around language and skill? And Eric drew this diagram, and he said, "I've been thinking about something. I have these learners who understand that the word means something, right? So he's calling the words the literal." In his mind, okay, in his way he's describing it, and the physical is the actual thing, the object, like a computer or a laptop or something. And then the virtual is his explanation, right? So he's got another piece. And then the conceptual is them actually being able to put those 3, take the instruction, take the word, take the concrete object or artifact or whatever it is they're supposed to be doing, and actually be able to make use of it all together. And this was the first time anybody had provided such a rich description of the actual goal of their instruction, which was not just skills and words, but actually concepts. So I think this is something that I'm going to be reading more into and theorizing a little bit more, because I think it's probably one of the more significant findings from this study. Let me just give you an example. So the conversation continued with this question, so what is it to know a word? And they came up with this statement. So it's the ability to transfer that knowledge to other things. And then he gives an example. So for example, let's say bold in Microsoft Word, almost all my learners can identify and name it and show you where it is. And they can't tell me what it does exactly, but they can do it. But then we go to email, and I'll point to the B, and people won't be able to tell me what it's for. So the goal is to create opportunities for learning that is actually transferable to other contexts. And within this lesson, it's concerning, in these programs it's concerning, but it's also more concerning when you think about why they're learning the skills in the first place, which is to be able to take them out into the larger world and make use of them. This is reinforced by a comment from another of the core members from a different site. So, she says, with the North Star, my students will look at the click and drag question and they'll say, I've never seen anything like this before. And she says, I do this every day with you guys, come on. But seeing it in the assessment is just so difficult because it's a different context. So I started thinking about this then. So what is it to actually know a digital literacy concept? And it's knowing the key vocabulary describing the skill, recognizing the vocabulary and skill in multiple contexts, and then being able to actually use that skill in multiple contexts. So this is the goal of the instruction. And I think the goal of any of the instructional materials that get developed out of this dissertation project will be with that goal in mind. So remember from the beginning, design-based research has two goals generally, and one is to solve a local problem, and the other then is to contribute knowledge about teaching and learning that is that can be more broadly applied. And so we have implications for practitioners and then also theoretical implications. The main point of this work was to support future corps members, right? So each of these community technology labs rely on volunteers or AmeriCorps members. So to have in place some sort of resource that anybody can just show up and start using with some confidence would be extremely useful and support the sustainability of the project, which is another goal of DBR. You're not just supposed to drop in, make something and leave, and then it goes away. You're supposed to ensure its sustainability and lasting impact. So to the extent that that's possible, I think that that's the goal of the work. So this idea around instruction about a concept rather than just skills and vocabulary is something that we can create resources around and embed in this teacher's corner that we've created on the site. And then along with that, making sure that we've got a range of multiple resources for helping learners get access to the vocabulary so that they can then start being able to describe the skills that they have. These are just some quotes from some of the focus groups that I thought were interesting. So interestingly, one of the very talented corps member, I thought I just wasn't a good teacher. I followed the websites that the former corps member, had used, and they just didn't work. It was so frustrating, and so this, automatically she assumed it was her fault. But the learners were totally different. The context was totally different, and so the goal then was to create this resource so that the other people don't have to feel like they're making the same mistakes. So with respect to implications for research, this is where I am right now in my thinking, and I think that I need more time in the data myself too. But I think there's something around connecting ideational choices and context to understanding a concept versus a skill or a vocabulary word. I think that. And then I think that if that's made very clear to these teachers as they're in any training that's possible for them, that it could really help. It could help not only them but their learners in the future. So lots more opportunities for data mining to further develop my understanding of field, and then when that's done, maybe perhaps moving on to the other variables. But if anybody is doing research in this area and has ideas about making this connection, so we were talking a little bit earlier about how some of this theory is so far removed from classroom practice that it's nice to have like intermediary theories to make the bridge, and so that's what I'm looking for in reading. So thank you to CARLA for the support, and thanks to CNI and SLE and CEHD for the support. Because I do this work because I've always been a teacher and I just want to help other people be teachers too. So I appreciate your support in that work. Yeah, thanks. Yes.
So I was really intrigued by what you had to say about what it means to know a word, and then not being able to take that sort of conceptual understanding and apply it to a new context from a learner perspective. But it made me think about research on teacher development that really focuses on the same thing. So if you've read anything about sort of the twisting path of concept development, like Novice, migrants, all of his co-works and Rankin and Becker, the idea that knowledge of understanding of what something means is very different from being able to apply that knowledge to something new. And I wonder if might be a pathway for you to help think about other issues related to the field. And I don't know if those two things can be linked, but it's very common. What you reported is very common in other types of learning situations.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And that's exactly the kind of suggestion I'm looking for.
Yeah.
And so who did you say?
I can send you some references.
That would be great. Yeah.
But it's, this concept development is a really long-term and complicated process.
Well, and I like this better. I've been thinking about just, getting into more more linguistic analysis, just on like sign and signified and signifier, but that's not as interesting pedagogically, and less. I mean, in the adult basic education world, everything is very, very practical. I mean, they want good research, but it has to be very accessible and practical. And so that sounds like something that would be. Yeah. Great. Thanks. That's great. Thank you. Yeah, Rachel.
How did you? Well, two things. Could you show us one more time the diagram that one of your that one?
Yeah.
Did you talk about the lines?
Yeah, so what he said, I can talk about it here. What he said is that the literal to the physical and the literal to the virtual. So the words, basically the words to the thing and then the words to the instruction, he sees his learners fine with. But it's the word to the concept.
Yeah. Which is in that application.
Yeah. That.
Seeing it in email and then in Word.
Right. Right. Yeah, he was a BA anthropology anthropologist and recent grad, but totally big thinker, ideas finder. Really interesting to work with. Yeah.
Well, this is a little different, but the summertime is a particularly chaotic time for ABE.
Yeah.
Wondering how you dealt with that in your research.
Yeah, we didn't get much done.
Okay.
we kind of had to take a break.
Okay.
So this site was presented and built in over the 2 months, slowly, and presented in August. And then actually the biggest interruption in the data collection was the transition from one set of core members to the next. So nothing happened for like 3 months while they were getting their they were getting their feet under them, and so it's research that's over a long time, but with gaps without interaction. Well, and yes, and so then we brought one person in. Yeah, Mel.
I'm wondering about your focus groups, and you talked a little bit about sort of the questions that you would ask them. I was wondering if you could share a few more of the questions or topics for discussion. And
yeah. Right. So the focus groups were mostly in support for the first paper. The first project were around identifying their instructional challenges. So most of the questions were, I basically had narrative-based questions where I would ask them to tell me about something interesting or frustrating that had happened around particular details. The other thing that I did, though, for that first study was to ask them about about TPAC. Do we know TPAC? Technology, pedagogy, and content knowledge. It's an extension of Schulman's content and pedagogical knowledge frame where you throw technology in. So within TPAC, you can use TPAC as a framework to think about appropriate uses of technology to best support your pedagogical approach and the content you want to deliver. And I asked them, we pulled out the TPAC model and we had one focus group discussion on where they saw themselves in that framework. So it would help with the point of helping elucidate areas of support that were most needed. So, and around the other like really interesting thing about the focus group data is that is this idea around engagement, where they kept talking about decisions that they would make within the flow of their instruction, and they kept saying, well, they're not engaged. And so then we had a whole focus group discussion on what it means to be engaged and how they know learners are engaged. And we actually wrote a definition.
How did that go?
It was great. It was fascinating, and so then that's part of the resource that gets passed on to the next learners. I had questions on on what they do with vocabulary later into this particular study. You know, where does vocabulary fit within your instruction? So there were some very explicit questions about that too. Essentially, my focus groups were responding to whatever I had seen in the data from the previous classroom observations, and then I was able to follow up on. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah.
I was gonna thank you for this, for your presentation. First off, I thought it was just really well done, it's thoughtful and really interesting. I'm wondering if you're aware of or it might be interesting for you to look at that form use meaning frame that Paul Nation uses around words.
Okay, great.
And word knowledge development. It's actually very rich and thoughtful, I think, and you might find it interesting with this literal, physical, conceptual piece. And the second thing, I guess I wanted to piggyback off of what Kate said, and which is that I think it's a pretty core finding in educational psychology, just basic teaching and learning piece, that challenge of transferring across contexts, and that teaching and the absolute need to be explicit about teaching across contexts.
Yeah.
So I just had a conversation with John Quake, who I work with over at CARLA, and he had just had some ed psych class and was all excited about it. I'll ask him what were some of the theories, because he was just telling me that this was an aha he brought back from one of his classes that he's doing right now on cognition. And if I can get him to narrow it down to a couple of studies, I'll send him.
That'd be great. Thanks. Yeah. Kendall, did you have a question?
Just sort of thinking about the engagement piece and, looking just a little bit at the materials, the language and literacy demands seem so high.
Yeah, they are. Yeah.
I'm kind of imagining that the students are engaged with just doing the technological tasks and almost can see all the English language, academic vocabulary is superfluous or getting in the way.
Yeah.
So I'm just sort of wondering a little bit about that tension, but also whether there was space to use native languages and if that came up as something that might be productive.
Yeah. Okay, so I can answer the first question with something I've been thinking about, and that I think that that's actually the reason for this disconnect that Eric is seeing, and I just need to explore the data more deeply in order to understand that that's happening or not. But yeah, it's clear. Yeah, he tried to introduce Somali in the classroom. He tried to have he used Google Translate, and he used colleagues who worked in other parts of the organization, and this is the same stuff that we've seen whenever we introduce Somali text in a classroom where people have different orthography, even, or they're spelling things different ways. There's different grammar, even, and or just not even having worked on Somali literacy. So he didn't find it that useful. But one interesting thing he did, he was very welcoming of other languages, and he was very happy whenever there was a bilingual volunteer. And he, to the extent that he could, he did create opportunities and representations of Somali. I didn't mean to show this as like data today, but so you can see he's open to it. And he has some Somali words on some of the slides. And so that helps those speakers anyway. He had no shared languages with any of his students, although he could speak Spanish. Didn't help him in this context. But yeah, I think you're right. And he actually looked hard for Somali bilingual resources, and we found a couple that did work, that had audio, Somali audio. So that was very helpful. Yeah, that's a really easy, that's a good way to get in with that. Yeah, Mel.
One more. So piggybacking on Kendall's question, what about even if like the written supports weren't used that much, what about students in the classroom helping each other?
Yeah.
I know that might be outside of the scope of this paper, but I wonder.
No, I think that was happening a lot. I could see it happening a lot, and then in the audio data there is this undercurrent of Somali happening.
Okay.
So it was a very social environment, very supportive environment. Yeah. But that wasn't built in as a pedagogical strategy. Like, it wasn't intentional. He didn't make space for it. It just happened.
But they also weren't shutting it down.
No. Oh, no. He couldn't have shut it down. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah, Jenna.
I think you talked at the beginning, they were coming from different sites, or they all in the same place?
They all had different locations.
So, and then something about the last slide you showed me, there was a quote about wanting to leave something for the teachers who come next so that they don't make the same mistakes I made.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking about, so some design research talks about infrastructuring as a component of the design, not just the tools that get created, but also infrastructuring that occurs during, and I'm thinking about the contingent employment. So many of basic educators, you're talking about AmeriCorps members who rotate every year or 2 years.
It's like a year, yeah.
So I'm wondering, you've created a community of practice by engaging in the DDR together, but then next year, none of them.
Yeah.
And then, so I'm wondering about the infrastructure
That's,
piece, how it doesn't just disappear into the world of websites.
It's happening intentionally in 2 ways. The first is that we are creating a structure around cloning this Weebly site and creating all the materials that somebody might need to customize it. So it's sort of like the next phase of the study is dissemination. So that's one way. The other way is the organizing agency that's the fiscal agent for this AmeriCorps program is very interested in having this work stay active. So I'll probably me, but they've actually encouraged the Corps members themselves to do some GoFundMe stuff to raise a little money so that they could come back next year and do training. So we're trying to take it away from like me as the glue and put it out into the community a little bit because of that, that need to keep it, to keep it, buoyed up by people other than just my interest. So it will be around. And Weebly will let you clone a site up to 10 times. And they've let me create dummy accounts. So far I have 40. So we have a lot of sites that we can use. So we just have to create this infrastructure that won't drown me for disseminating this. But that's the exciting part of the work too, because every time I talk about this site, and I've shown this at some practitioner conferences, people are just, they really need it. They really need something. And it's free. One of our design specifications that I was actually a good partner in this work. I think my positionality was very, I tried to have a very neutral positionality where I have skills and I was supportive where needed, but I didn't direct the project. However, there were a few things that I required. One is that we don't make any coding adjustments to the template. It had to be a Weebly template that didn't get altered, because hardly anybody has developer skills, right? I mean, people do more and more these days. It's surprising, but I didn't want that to be a requirement for use of the site. So that will help too, I think. Yeah, Kate.
I just have a quick clarification question about your use of SFL, so that I can contact colleagues that might be able to help you.
Yeah, sure.
So you're looking specifically at how the teachers are using language to make ideational choices. So you're looking at L1. They're all L1 speakers.
They are, yeah.
Okay, and so you're not interested in the students.
Well, this paper was from the lens of, from the perspective of the instructor. I mean, that's what this whole dissertation phase is about, instructional challenges. And that was a choice that I made primarily because with such quickly shifting populations in the classroom and not being able to count on a learner coming back on any number of subsequent days to interview, it just was logistically useful to get to focus from this instructor side, but then I also had these assumptions from the pilot about instruction, but from the learner side, so I wanted to confirm those. So yeah, but more broadly, I'm interested in just exploring the use of the language from both sides. Any other questions? Well, I just am so grateful that you guys all sat here and listened to this. I love this stuff, and I know it's like, it's a small topic. But thank you very much for your questions and your suggestions.